Hello everyone, my name is Jodi Lyons. I'm the CEO of Senior Sherpa and your host today for Your Need to Know. I'm joined today by Dr. William Mansbach, who is the creator of the Brief Cognitive Assessment Tool, the BCAT, which is a cognitive and mood assessment, and it's used worldwide by tens of thousands of people. Today we're here to discuss what you need to know to keep your brain healthy. Why do you need to keep your brain healthy? Well, most people are afraid of Alzheimer's or other dementias, and we're hoping to give you a few tips to help you be less afraid and be a little more productive. So the first thing I want to talk about is I just used the words Alzheimer's and dementia, and a lot of people don't know the difference. So I'm glad you're here, Dr. Mansbach, to explain the difference.
I'm happy to do that.
Okay.
So let's first start with the term dementia. This is a medical term. It refers to a collection of symptoms.
Okay.
There are lots of ways of describing it, and there are new guidelines that have been recently published for healthcare providers. But I think for the audience, maybe the best and simplest way to think about dementia is in terms of 5 different points. Think about them as 5 points on a circle.
Okay.
The first one is there must be a deficit, an impairment in the ability to make new memories, so memory impairment.
Okay.
This doesn't mean the ability to remember things from 50 or 60 years ago, but instead it's the inability or problem in making a new memory, sort of prospective, learning something new.
Okay.
Great way to think about it.
Okay.
That's number one. Number two, there must be a deficit in one of the other cognitive domains, and there are many different cognitive domains, but the one that I think is probably most frequently occurring is what we call the executive functions, Jodi. Okay. So think about the CEO of a company or the conductor of an orchestra. So the executive functions are sort of the CEO of the brain. So these are things like problem solving and judgment, reasoning, sequencing, planning, things of that sort, right? So generally, if you have dementia, you have a problem in executive functions or some other cognitive deficit, and always you have a deficit in memory. So those are 2 of the 5 points. Okay. The third is that the severity of these deficits has to be such that it interferes with day-to-day functioning. Interfering with day-to-day functioning, right? So what are people really thinking about?
Exactly. What does it mean in practical terms?
You describe as the IADLs, right?
Yes.
The instrumental activities of daily living. So these are things like managing finances, managing trips to the grocery store, being able to cook, laundry, those kinds of higher order day-to-day features that one has to do. So that for those people who meet criteria for dementia, because of their memory issues, because of their executive function issues, they have difficulties in those areas. That's the third point.
So that's the part of going to the grocery store and getting what you need and getting home safely.
Exactly.
Okay.
So.
Okay.
Exactly so.
So what's the third one?
Okay. So well, that is the third one.
See, look at that.
So the fourth way to think about this is that these deficits must, in some ways, be explained by a disease, like Alzheimer's disease, something of that sort. But they can't be explained by a temporary condition like delirium, which is a
urinary tract infection.
Right, a medical problem that can cause a temporary problem.
Okay. So this is its
or depression, or anxiety, or something of that sort.
Okay.
Right? So what we're really talking about here is we're talking about a problem with memory. We're talking about a problem in another area, usually executive functions. We're talking about the idea that it must be severe enough to interfere with day-to-day functioning, like those IADLs for the most part. The one feature, the last sort of point on the circle, though, is that there must be a change in these areas. In other words, the deficit that you see today was not the deficit of yesterday, so that there's a drop-off in cognitive capacity.
It's a change. It's not the person who always lost their car keys. It's newly losing their car keys or something like that.
Right, or not losing their car keys any more than they used to.
Okay.
Maybe that's the way to put it.
That's a good way to put it. That's a good way to put it.
So those 5 things are a way of thinking about if you meet those criteria, you likely have dementia. But dementia should be thought of in terms of cause and effect, Jodi. So the effect is dementia, but there must be a disease cause, right? Okay. So the most common one, of course, is the one that people are most afraid of, the one that starts with an A, and that would be called?
Exactly, it's Alzheimer's, and that's what people are most afraid of. Although I have to say, the other dementias are scary.
They are scary.
I once had a client who said, "Oh, thank God, my mother does not have Alzheimer's. She only has vascular dementia."
Right.
And so we know they're all scary.
Right, and we think of dementia as having 12, even 13 primary causes. The most common one being Alzheimer's disease,
right.
The second most being vascular dementia, but there are other ones as well.
So now that we've identified the boogeyman in the corner, and it is as scary as we think it is.
It is indeed.
One of the challenges that I've had is with the caregivers, where it's the adult child of the person with dementia, or a sibling or a spouse. So somebody who's caring for somebody with dementia is terrified that they're going to get it. Is there anything at all that people can do to prevent it, slow their chances of getting it, anything at all?
Well, let's start with language.
Okay.
I think the word prevention is problematic because if we say we have measures to prevent a disease or a course leading to dementia, that would mean that the science says if you do these things, it will not happen to you. And we can't say that.
Okay.
What we can say, and I think this is the good news situation, is that there are certain habits, what we call the 6 healthy habits. We use the acronym ANTHEM, and we'll talk about them.
Right.
If one practices those 6 habits during middle age and beyond, you are reducing the likelihood of having Alzheimer's disease or another similar illness that can cause dementia.
So the prevention, using the term loosely, really has to start in middle age, not age, 75, or postponing that. It's got to start 40s and 50s.
It's like anything else, Jodi. The earlier you begin, because these are healthy habits, the better you will be, because these habits not only are good for your brain, but they're good for your heart. They're good for your cardiovascular system in general. These are things that one should do, but certainly earlier you start, the better off you are.
Okay, so can we talk about what ANTHEM, I love the acronym, it's easy to remember. So let's test your memory. What does the A for ANTHEM stand for?
Add cognitive stimulation.
That's good, you remember that.
I remember that one.
So what do you mean?
Right, cognitive stimulation. So what I really mean is that it's very important on a day-to-day basis, a minimum of 5 times a week, let's say, that one does certain cognitive exercises that the science says are brain healthy. That is, they promote what's called sort of neurobranching. The idea here is to make it very simple, is that we all have a large number of working neurons or brain cells. There are certain cognitive exercises that seem to promote better efficiencies, better neural economies in some ways. In other words, if you do these exercises, you're going to put yourself in a better situation for improving your memory and maybe resisting the memory decline that's associated with illnesses like Alzheimer's disease. Now, in order to identify what is really memory enhancing from a cognitive stimulation standpoint, that's where it gets tricky.
Well, exactly, because I've heard a lot about puzzles and games and word searches and dominoes and things like that. So what are you really talking about?
It's a billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar industry out there, the brain training, brain science, and so forth. So caveat emptor. In other words, buyer beware. So we would say that choose activities that have some evidence behind them. Right? And an example would be the BCAT Working Memory Exercise book. So this is something that people could use to do cognition and things of that sort. And there are other things that people can use. Beyond that, start with this idea, whatever you do to promote this kind of neurobranching that I talked about before. Some people use that term neuroplasticity. The exercises should be moderately difficult. Now, that won't surprise you. Think about, as an analogy, people who go to the gym, right? You want to build strength, so you lift weights. If you lift weights that are too light, you're not really doing anything. If you lift weights that are too heavy, you're really not doing anything because you can't lift them.
Right.
So moderately difficult. It should hurt your brain a bit. You know, it's
Okay.
sort of like trying to puzzle something out like, ooh, it's not so easy to do, and
Okay.
yet you can accomplish it. Having said that, one of the great things about these kinds of exercises and activities is that getting them right doesn't matter.
Oh, that's excellent.
What matters
So
is
it's
that
just
you
the
do
doing
them.
Okay.
You've heard us say this before, you know, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Getting it right is less important than getting it right, doing it. That's really important. So it should be moderately difficult. It should be frequent, as I said before.
Okay.
Frequent means at least 5 times a week. The duration is less important. 20 minutes is probably sufficient. These should be novel things. In other words, if you always do crossword puzzles and they're not hard for you, be different if they're progressively more challenging for
Okay.
you, that's not really doing much for your brain. I'll give you another analogy. I noticed that you're right-handed, yes? You're right-handed. If I asked you to write something down with your left hand, like this sentence, this is hard to do,
Right.
it would feel hard to do it, wouldn't it? It'd feel awkward.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's novel, and that's exactly what I mean. It should be novel. So it should be moderately difficult,
Okay.
should be frequent, should be novel, and it is best if it is meaningful or enjoyable. Think about this.
So not torture.
Well, you know, if you go to a gym in January, it's really crowded. If you go to that same gym in March, it's less crowded.
Right. And if you go in July, nobody's there.
So why is that? All those people who make their New Year's resolutions, they start. Now, the people who keep going tend to be people who see real value in doing it, right?
Okay.
And now there are other ways of explaining it, but that's sort of one way of doing it. So in terms of adding cognitive stimulation, this is kind of what we mean.
And so this works for everybody middle-aged and above.
Works
So-
for everyone.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So the next letter in ANTHEM was N.
Right.
What's
and
that?
for no smoking.
No, probably no donuts.
No. Well, that's actually not
That's
in
for the
ANTHEM, but we could talk about that
yes.
also. No smoking.
Right.
So this is sort of an interesting finding that's been replicated many times before. So in our center, as we make sense of what are the risk factors for dementia, smoking is clearly a risk factor. It's a risk factor for a couple of different reasons, Jodi. One is its negative impact on your cardiovascular functioning. Generally speaking, things that are bad for your heart and your cardio system are bad for your brain, generally speaking.
That's a good point.
So by no smoking, we mean stop as early as you can. And there seems to be some evidence that if you have stopped smoking for 20 years or more, you've really lowered the threshold. You've lowered the negative impact of this.
That's great news.
Yeah.
And we will be back in just a minute.
Hey, Lena, where's yours?
Hello again. Once again, I'm Jodi Lyons, and I'm here with Dr. William Mansbach. And today we are talking about your need to know about how to keep your brain healthy. And before the break, Dr. Mansbach, you started talking about ANTHEM, A-N-T-H-E-M, as a way to keep your brain healthy. So we talked about adding cognitive stimulation, and N for not smoking. I was going to say stopping smoking, so it could be an N
S.
or an S. Yeah, N or an S. What is T?
So T may surprise your audience, but T stands for treating depression. Treating depression, right? Depression is a
surprised
risk
by that.
factor for dementia.
For dementia, yeah. I'm surprised by that.
So this is a poorly understood, at least correlation or association with chronic depression. Now, let me make a distinction here.
Okay.
I am not saying that having depression is necessarily a risk factor for becoming demented years later.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that having depression that is untreated seems to be associated with a higher likelihood of Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia in the later years. So you could be talking about a difference of 50 years, right? Untreated depression for a very long time. So you would be probably wondering, well, why would depression...
Well, I'm wondering how they're related and what does it do?
As I said, it's poorly understood, but the connection seems to be a neurophysiological one. So what I mean by that is that people who are depressed actually have a change in their neurochemistry, and that change in their neurochemistry seems to impact on the health of those brain cells, those neurons themselves. Now, the good news, because I think you can always find a silver lining in each of these habits.
I'm wondering what that is. Okay, yes.
Is treatment, really.
Okay.
And so treatment really begins first with identification. So it's very important that people recognize the symptoms of depression, both among older adults, which present a little bit differently than people who are adults but who are younger than that. That rather than feeling a sense of shame, avoiding evaluation and treatment, that you do just the opposite. Because if you think about it not just as a way of treating an actual condition today, but maybe preventing or lowering the risk of Alzheimer's disease or another dementia down the road, perhaps people would be more motivated to do so. So that's the connection.
So it's, again, knowing what you're dealing with so that you can deal with it.
Exactly.
Depression's one of them. Which brings us to H. What is the H in ANTHEM?
Healthy weight. Now, healthy weight is not the same thing as everyone being rail thin skinny. Healthy weight means a couple of things, really. One, it means either avoiding the condition of diabetes, late onset diabetes, or type 2 diabetes in particular, and making sure that your lipids or internal fats are well controlled. Now, we have a much clearer understanding of the association between poor weight management and dementia in particular. And so the real key here is late onset diabetes, and it goes something like this. So if you look at the relationship between obesity and diabetes, what you would say is that anyone could be obese and not necessarily diabetic. However, if you have late onset diabetes, which basically means you develop this insulin problem in your adult years, or in your late adult years, but often in your adult years, 90% of the people who develop late onset diabetes are obese. That doesn't mean that everyone who's obese is going to be diabetic.
Right.
The connection between dementia and diabetes also is a neurophysiological one, and it has something to do with the impact of the body's difficulty in processing sugars naturally through insulin on the integrity or the health of those brain cells themselves. So the way to think about this is, if you're overweight, and even if you're not, make sure that your blood sugars are well maintained. Try to reduce the likelihood of diabetes, and if you have it, get it treated. Like with depression, being diabetic does not necessarily mean that you will develop dementia. What it does mean is that it's very important to keep those blood sugars in control, make sure that you take the medication that you should take, maintain all the healthy diabetic behaviors as well. Not only is it about watching what you eat, but it's also watching your exercise, your daily activities, and things of that sort.
So again, it's identify the issue and deal with it, and in this case, it's healthy weight, diabetes, and cholesterol.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. Lifestyle
management.
Yes.
Which leads us to E, which I know is exercise.
Right.
So what do you mean by it? We have to go become gym rats?
No, so this is the companion of A, which is adding cognitive stimulation. Okay. So this is E. So like with A, or adding cognitive stimulation, exercise should be individualized. Okay. It should be frequent. It doesn't have to be novel. By frequent, we're talking about a minimum of 5 times a week. That may seem like a lot for some and not a lot for others. So what do we mean by exercise? Okay, so everyone's different. It would be important for me to say you should check out, if you're thinking about a routine and aggressive physical exercise program, check this out with your physician. Make sure that you
Always
are
check
healthy
with the
enough to
doctor
do
first.
this,
Exactly.
right? These things are important, and increasingly as we get older, right? Okay. So by cardiovascular intensity, what we really mean is that exercises should be aerobic at least, and maybe anaerobic as well. But aerobic basically means is that, think about this. When you go for a walk with your friend, if you're able to have a conversation while you're walking with them, that's very good. And if you can still talk while you walk, that's aerobic.
Okay, that makes sense.
If you get to a point where you're huffing and puffing and you can't talk anymore, that's anaerobic. That's good too, but mostly we're focusing on aerobic activity. Make sure that for 45 minutes, 5 times a week, you get out there. It should be moderately intense. It doesn't have to be horrifically difficult. And there's a relationship, Jodi, isn't there, between the exercise that you do and sticking to it. If it's horrific, you're not going to keep doing it.
Exactly. And back to your analogy earlier of people don't go to the gym in March and April.
Right. Absolutely. So exercise is really important. Now, it's very important to recognize that among all the different brain-enhancing training programs that are out there, ours and other people, that you can engage those, the A in ANTHEM, but if you do that without the E, you're really not putting yourself in the best position possible. Remember, this is about lowering your risk.
So just doing the exercises for my brain while sitting in a nice chair with a Diet Coke is not exactly the plan?
I think you've gone to some of our lectures before where we show this slide, and on the slide it shows a woman who's at a bar and she's smoking a cigarette and she's having a drink and she's saying, I don't have to worry about this because I'm starting a cognitive exercise program tomorrow.
Exactly.
One other thing that I'd like to point out before we go to the last of these habits is one way you can think about the practice of all of these is in terms of a pyramid. You know, a pyramid is wider in the base and narrow at the very top.
Right.
So at the base should be making sure that your general health is good. Go to your doctor, work through with her, with him, what you should be doing to manage your major health systems, particularly your cardiovascular system, as we'll talk about in a moment. Sort of the next layer up is physical exercise, maintain physical exercise. And then finally at the top is the cognitive stimulation. You need to do all of it.
Which brings us to the last one, M, managing hypertension.
You've got it.
So am I correct that we would have to do N, H, and E to get to the M, or is there something else?
Well, you are right that they are related.
Okay.
The good news about that is if you're practicing one, you're improving another.
Okay.
Right? If you are physically exercising, you are probably improving hypertension. If you're doing something with hypertension, you're probably doing something that's going to help with your mood, for example.
Right.
So many of these are really connected. Hypertension. So as we get older, generally speaking, our blood pressure rises, particularly our systolic number. That's that top number, right? Systolic, diastolic's the bottom number. And by the way, as you are aware, I know you are, that there are new guidelines that have come out.
Yes.
And so rather than talking numbers, let's just talk principles or concepts. So cardiovascular health is a significant impactor on whether or not one is going to develop dementia. It's not the only one, as we know, and there are others too. Hypertension means that our blood pressure is high.
Okay.
So what happens? Well, under normal circumstances, those vessels that go throughout our body into our brains, because that's really where it's particularly relevant, are usually pretty pliable, pretty flexible, a little bit expandable. However, with hypertension, the rate, the force of blood, and this blood, by the way, carries oxygen.
Right.
And this is sort of the fuel for the brain in some ways, right? So if there's more and more pressure on those vessels, and particularly if those vessels have plaquing, cholesterol, it's putting more and more pressure on them, which increases the probability of blockages and actual hemorrhagic or internal bleeds in some ways. more than anything else, if we have high blood pressure, those neurons that need the blood oxygen, they just don't get the fuel that they need. If you know, and sort of oversimplifying it
So
in some
it
ways.
almost starves them.
Right.
Okay.
So now, if you think about it,
Yeah.
many people, you look at the most frequent medical diagnoses among older adults, 2 of them are hypertension and diabetes.
Right.
So immediately, if you control those, you're lowering your risk for dementia, particularly if this takes place in middle age, which I'm going to define for us artificially.
I know I'm not going to like this answer. Go ahead.
I'm gonna say 40 to 65 or 40 to 64 is the middle band
Fine.
years. Start earlier though, right?
There you go. So, middle-aged people, caregivers, older adults, can reduce, or they can either reduce their chances of getting a dementia, or at the very least, be doing something positive. I find that a lot of people get really worried, scared, and then feel really helpless because they have nothing to do, no action to take, other than to sit and wait for what they feel is inevitable.
Right.
So can you talk for a minute about caregiver risk? So we've talked about ANTHEM, which are things we can all do and should do to keep ourselves healthier. Caregivers seem to be at a particular risk for getting sick, even if it's not dementia that they're getting. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Right. So one of the issues for caregivers, well, among many issues, is the constant stress and lack of relief and respite in trying to take care of somebody. So you are aware that from a mood standpoint, caregivers of someone who has dementia are 5 times more likely to develop a major depressive episode, 5 times more likely to have a condition called generalized anxiety disorder, persistently high anxiety.
Right.
They're even more likely to develop cognitive problems than their age-matched peers who are not taking care of somebody with dementia.
So I want to make sure I got that.
Yeah.
People who are caregivers for people with dementia are actually more likely to have cognitive impairment themselves than their peers who are not.
Over the years,
Over the years.
they are. Once again, the good news is there are things that can be done with that, and ANTHEM is one way for caregivers to lower their risk of developing dementia, Alzheimer's disease dementia, or some other form of that.
Well, that's wonderful. So there really is something people can do. It's called ANTHEM. Thank you, Dr. Mansbach. Really appreciate your time and had
Pleasure
some fun
being
with
here
you today.
Thank you very much.